Hello and welcome to Cheating Husband Story.
I'm filing for divorce next week. I've moved all our investments offshore. Good luck finding anything when my lawyers are done. By the way, I've cancelled your access to all accounts. The email from my husband arrived at 3:14 a.m. while he was supposedly on a business trip to Singapore. I read it twice, the blue light of my screen illuminating my face in the darkness of our Boston penthouse. Poor Richard. He had no idea that I had already emptied every account he thought was secure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The offshore accounts he was so proud of, already redirected. The property holdings, transferred months ago. By the time his plane landed back in the States, he wouldn't even have a home to return to. I set my phone down on the marble countertop, the screen's glow catching the edge of my wedding ring. 15 years of marriage reduced to a middle-of-the-night email. Not even a phone call. I suppose I should have felt something. Rage, perhaps, or heartbreak. Instead, I felt a curious sense of calm, like watching the final piece of a complex puzzle slide perfectly into place. The city lights twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our 38th floor penthouse. Correction, my penthouse now. The night was clear, the kind of crisp autumn evening that Boston does so well. Below me, the city continued its regular rhythm, oblivious to the small war being quietly declared in the luxury buildings towering above. I poured myself a glass of the Macallan 25, Richard's prize scotch that he saved for special occasions. This certainly qualified. The amber liquid caught the light as I swirled it gently, savoring the moment. Richard had always underestimated me. When we met, I was just finishing my MBA at Wharton, while he was already 10 years into his career as an investment banker. He'd found my academic understanding of finance amusing, even quaint. He never bothered to discover that before business school, I'd spent 5 years in forensic accounting. The first sign had come about 18 months ago. A missed dinner here, a weekend conference there. Standard clichés, really. I might have dismissed it as the natural drift of a long marriage, if not for the unexplained transfers from our joint investment account. Small at first, just $10,000 or $15,000, but growing larger over time. When confronted, he'd wave it away as portfolio rebalancing and launch into explanations so technical he knew my eyes would glaze over. He was right. My eyes did glaze over, not from confusion, but from calculation. Each patronizing explanation was another thread in the tapestry of evidence I was quietly gathering. I took a slow sip of the scotch, letting it burn a warm path down my throat. Our home was silent, except for the gentle hum of the climate control system. In the spare bedroom down the hall, 3 accordion folders contained every document I needed. Account statements, property deeds, offshore registrations, digital records of transfers, all meticulously organized, all legally obtained. I'd spent over a year building my case, moving through our lives like a ghost, present but unseeable. The second warning had come when I noticed Richard had created a new email account. He'd used our home computer and forgotten to log out. A small mistake, but in marriages like ours, small mistakes were often the only window into the truth. The emails revealed communications with attorneys specializing in asset protection and international finance law. There were questions about Massachusetts divorce statutes and property division, detailed inquiries about jurisdictions that favored the higher earning spouse. I hadn't confronted him then either. Instead, I'd photographed everything, logged out, and begun my own research. If Richard was planning a strategic divorce, he would find himself outmaneuvered at every turn. By month 3 of my counter-operation, I had mapped our entire financial landscape. The retirement accounts, the offshore structures in the Caymans and Singapore, the shell company in Delaware that owned our vacation property in Nantucket, the Bitcoin wallet he thought I knew nothing about. Richard had built a complex web designed to obscure our true worth, originally to minimize tax exposure, but now, evidently, to hide assets from his wife. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very structures he'd created to shield our wealth from the government now provided me with the blueprint to redirect that wealth right under his nose. My counter-strategy had been methodical, deliberate. I began with the smallest accounts, the ones he rarely checked. Small transfers, innocuous movements that wouldn't trigger any alerts. I established my own offshore structures mirroring his, but with crucial differences that made mine untraceable to our marital assets. I created documentation that predated his planning, establishing claims that would supersede his in any court. I set the glass down and walked to the window, watching my reflection overlaid on the city lights. In the darkness, I could just make out my features, the set of my jaw, the steady gaze that had served me well in boardrooms and negotiations. Richard had always told me I looked too serious, that I should smile more. Another red flag I had ignored for too long. The most satisfying part of my operation had been the real estate transfers. Our penthouse, purchased 5 years ago during the market dip, had nearly doubled in value. Richard had put it in a living trust to protect it from creditors. What he didn't realize was that I had gradually amended the trust over time, using the power of attorney he had given me years ago when he thought I was just handling household matters. The trust now stipulated that in the event of divorce filing by either party, the property would revert solely to me. The vacation home in Nantucket had been trickier, held as it was by the Delaware LLC, but Richard had made a critical error. He had registered the LLC when we were in Delaware for a weekend, rushing through the paperwork and listing me as the managing member to avoid raising questions about why a Massachusetts banker needed a Delaware company. He thought it was a formality. I knew it was leverage. 3 months ago, I had transferred ownership of that LLC to a new holding company registered in my maiden name, with documentation showing I had purchased it at fair market value. The trail of money led through 3 different countries before disappearing completely. I checked my watch, a delicate Patek Philippe that Richard had given me for our 10th anniversary. It was almost 4 a.m. in Singapore. It would be late afternoon. Richard was probably sitting in some gleaming skyscraper, congratulating himself on his clever strategy, imagining me reading his email with shock and despair. Perhaps he was already celebrating with whoever had replaced me in his affections. There was always someone, wasn't there? In marriages like ours, there always was. I walked back to the counter and picked up my phone again. No response needed. Not yet. Let him think his message had devastated me. Let him imagine me panicking, calling friends, perhaps consulting attorneys who would tell me it was too late. The longer he believed he had won, the sweeter the moment of revelation would be. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to soften the eastern sky. A new day. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of genuine anticipation. The careful planning, the meticulous execution, the countless nights spent constructing this parallel financial universe, all of it was about to bear fruit. I finished the scotch and set the glass in the sink. In a few hours, I would call my attorney and initiate my own filing, complete with full documentation of the assets Richard thought he had hidden. By the time his plane touched down at Logan International, the trap would be sprung, the accounts frozen, the properties secured. Richard had taught me many things during our marriage, but the most valuable lesson was one he never intended. Patience is the ultimate power, and I had been very, very patient. I slept surprisingly well that night. 4 solid hours of dreamless rest, the kind that comes with absolute certainty. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the blinds I'd forgotten to close, painting bright stripes across our Italian marble floors. Richard had insisted on the marble during our renovation 3 years ago. Carrara marble, Eleanor. Accept no substitutes. Despite the contractor's warnings about maintenance in a New England climate, the first winter it had cracked along the south wall. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Richard had been furious, blaming everyone but his own insistence on form over function. That was Richard in essence. beautiful things that couldn't withstand pressure. I made myself coffee using the elaborate espresso machine that Richard had imported from Milan, another trophy purchase that required constant attention. I'd become quite good at maintaining it, just as I'd become good at maintaining so many things in our marriage. The bitter aroma filled the kitchen as I pulled up my secure email account on my tablet. My attorney, Vivian Park, was already online. An early riser like me, I'd hired her 14 months ago, right after discovering the first suspicious transfers. Vivian had made a name for herself, representing women in high-net-worth divorces throughout New England. She wasn't just good. She was surgical in her precision. "It's time," I wrote. He sent the email exactly as we anticipated. Her response came within minutes. "Executing Phase 1 today. Meeting at 11 a.m. "I'll be there," I confirmed. I set the tablet down and looked around the penthouse. 3,200 square feet of luxury that had never quite felt like home. The modern art Richard had collected adorned the walls, each piece selected not for its beauty, but for its investment potential and name recognition. "Rothkos are having a moment," he'd explained, when bringing home a canvas of blurred rectangles that cost more than my parents' entire house. I never told him I found it cold, impersonal. The morning sun caught the diamond on my left hand, sending prisms dancing across the white countertop. I twisted the ring thoughtfully, feeling its familiar weight. Richard had upgraded it 3 times during our marriage, each new stone marking a promotion or significant bonus. The current iteration was just over 4 carats. "Flawless, just like you should be," he'd said when presenting it on our 12th anniversary. I slid it off and placed it on the counter. The indentation it left behind would fade quickly enough. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Catherine. "Did you tell him yet?" Catherine was the only family member who knew what was coming. As a divorce attorney herself, though in Colorado rather than Massachusetts, she had been an invaluable sounding board. "Not yet," I replied, "but he made the first move this morning. Email divorce declaration." Her response was immediate. "What a coward. Are you okay?" Was I okay? I considered the question carefully as I sipped my coffee. Anger had come in the early months of discovery, white-hot rage at the betrayal, not just of his apparent infidelity, but the calculated financial deception. Then had come a cold, clarifying fury that sharpened my focus and strengthened my resolve. But now, standing in the sunlight with Richard's dismissive email sitting in my inbox, what I felt was something closer to pity. "I'm better than okay," I typed back. "I'm ready." I set my empty cup in the sink and went to dress for my meeting with Vivian. My closet was a carefully curated collection of designer pieces selected over the years to project exactly the image Richard thought appropriate for the wife of a senior investment banker. Today, I selected items he had never seen, things I'd purchased in the past year and kept in the back, tags removed but never worn. A charcoal pencil skirt from a boutique in the South End, a cream silk blouse, heels that were slightly higher than Richard preferred. Small rebellions, but they felt significant. As I dressed, I mentally reviewed the timeline we'd established. Richard's flight was scheduled to land at Logan tomorrow at 2:15 p.m. By then, the initial legal filings would be complete. The freeze orders on the primary accounts would be in place, the property transfer notifications would be registered, and the forensic accounting report, all 147 meticulously documented pages, would be in the hands of both our attorneys and the relevant tax authorities. I applied my makeup with careful precision, taking more time than usual. There was no reason to rush today. Everything had been prepared months in advance. The weight of secrecy that had pressed on me for so long had lifted, leaving a strange lightness in its wake. My phone rang just as I was fastening my grandmother's pearl earrings, the only jewelry I'd brought into the marriage. It was Vivian. "Eleanor," she said without preamble. "The offshore accounts in Singapore are showing activity this morning. Large transfers initiated in the last hour." I smiled as I secured the second earring. "Right on schedule." "You're sure about this strategy?" Once we file the emergency petition, there's no going back. Richard will know immediately that you've been tracking his movements. He's moving the money exactly as we predicted he would, I said, checking my reflection one final time. Let him transfer to the Cayman account. That's where we want it. Because of the treaty, Vivian said, understanding immediately. Exactly. The Singapore accounts are protected by privacy laws that would take years to penetrate. But the second he moves that money to the Caymans, it falls under the financial enforcement agreement. We can freeze it with a single filing. There was a pause on the line. You know, in 15 years of practice, I've never had a client who understood international banking regulations better than their banker husband. Richard always did say my attention to detail was excessive, I replied, picking up my handbag and keys. He meant it as criticism. As I stepped into the elevator, I felt a momentary wave of something. Not quite regret, but acknowledgement. 15 years was a significant investment of time, energy, and youth. There had been moments of real connection, genuine affection. Richard hadn't always been the calculating man he'd become. Or perhaps he had, and I simply hadn't wanted to see it. The elevator descended smoothly, each floor marking another step away from the life I'd built with Richard. By the time it reached the lobby, I had mentally catalogued and stored away the memories worth keeping. The rest I would leave behind, like outdated clothes that no longer fit. Martin, the doorman who had watched me come and go for 5 years, tipped his hat as I crossed the marble lobby. "Beautiful day, Mrs. Harrington." "It certainly is, Martin," I replied, feeling the September sun warm on my face as he held the door. "And please, call me Eleanor." "Of course, Miss Eleanor," he corrected himself with a smile. The air outside was crisp with early autumn, carrying the faint scent of change. I checked my watch as I walked toward the parking garage where my car, purchased 6 months ago under my maiden name, was waiting. I had 40 minutes before my meeting with Vivian, just enough time to stop at the bank and execute the final step in this phase of my plan. As I walked, I felt strangely unburdened. There was no more hiding, no more pretending, no more careful maintenance of a marriage that existed only on the surface. For the first time in years, I was moving towards something rather than carefully preserving what I knew was already lost. My phone buzzed with another message, not Catherine this time, but my notification system alerting me that Richard had just checked out of his hotel in Singapore. In approximately 22 hours, he would land in Boston, expecting to find his shell of a wife grappling with shock and despair. Instead, he would find himself facing the consequences of underestimating the woman he had married, and I would be long gone, having reclaimed not just our assets, but my future. Vivian's office occupied the 15th floor of a sleek glass building in Boston's financial district. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the harbor, though I doubted many of her clients appreciated the scenery. People didn't come to Vivian Park when their lives were going well. Her receptionist, a polished young man with impeccable posture, greeted me by name. "Mrs. Harrington, Miss Park is expecting you. May I get you anything? Water, coffee?" "Water would be fine, thank you," I replied, settling into one of the minimalist chairs in the waiting area. The walls were adorned with abstract art in soothing blues and greys, nothing like the aggressive statement pieces Richard preferred. The effect was intentionally calming, a sanctuary for people whose personal lives were in turmoil. I recognized the strategy. I'd employed similar tactics when designing my own consulting firm's offices years ago. Before I'd set aside my career to support Richard's, that had been my first significant compromise. We met at an industry conference in Chicago. I was representing my forensic accounting firm. He was already an ascending star at Blackridge Capital. Our backgrounds were similar enough to create common ground, different enough to seem complementary. He'd been charming, attentive, intellectually engaging. When he talked about his ambitions, his eyes lit with a passion that was irresistible. 6 months into our relationship, he'd been offered a promotion that required relocation to Boston. "Come with me," he'd said. "You can find work anywhere with your skills. This is my big chance." I'd been 32, successful, but not yet established enough to turn down the adventure of a new city, a new life. My firm had offices in Boston, smaller than Chicago, but growing. It seemed possible to have both, the relationship and the career. 2 years later, when we married, Richard was thriving. My own career had stalled in the transition. "You don't need to work," he'd reasoned. "We're more than comfortable with my income. And honestly, Eleanor, the optics are better for me at this level if my wife isn't working for someone else." It had seemed reasonable at the time. A temporary pause, perhaps consulting on my own terms later. The golden handcuffs had been lined with the promise of freedom later, travel, philanthropy, perhaps children. Instead, I'd found myself gradually transformed into an accessory, an asset in Richard's carefully curated life, expected to be available when needed, invisible when not. "Eleanor," Vivian's voice pulled me from my thoughts. She stood in the doorway to her office, elegant in a tailored navy suit, her silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a precise chignon. At 55, she radiated the kind of confidence that came from decades of winning battles most people never knew were being fought. I followed her into the corner office, where 3 other people waited around a polished conference table. I recognized Peter Goldman, Vivian's forensic accounting specialist, and Marie Chen, the junior attorney who had been handling much of the documentation. The third person, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, was unfamiliar. "Eleanor, you know Peter and Marie," Vivian said, gesturing to the familiar faces. "This is Judge Wallace Anderson, retired from the circuit court. He's been consulting with us on the more nuanced aspects of your case." I shook the judge's hand, noting his firm grip and evaluative gaze. "A pleasure, Mrs. Harrington. I've reviewed your documentation. Most impressive." "Thank you for your assistance, Judge," I replied, taking a seat at the table. Vivian remained standing, commanding the room with natural authority. "Before we proceed, Eleanor, I want to confirm that you're absolutely certain about moving forward today. Once we file these papers, particularly the emergency asset freeze on the Cayman accounts, there will be immediate repercussions." "I'm certain," I said. "Richard's email was explicit in his intentions." She nodded, satisfied. "Then let's review where we stand." Peter Goldman, a meticulous man with perpetually ink-stained fingers despite the digital age, opened his laptop. "As of 800 this morning, we've documented transfers from the Singapore accounts, totaling approximately $7 million, all directed to the Coastal Investment Holdings account in Grand Cayman. This represents about 60% of the assets Mr. Harrington had moved offshore over the past 18 months. He's leaving some in Singapore as a contingency," I noted. Classic Richard, never commit fully to anyone's strategy. "The timing works in our favor," Marie added, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency that had made her Vivian's rising star. "The transfers to Cayman fall within the look-back period for the emergency petition. We can reasonably argue that these represent attempts to hide marital assets in anticipation of divorce proceedings." Judge Anderson steepled his fingers. "The documentation you've provided regarding the timing of these transfers relative to Mr. Harrington's email is particularly compelling. It establishes clear intent." Vivian tapped her tablet, bringing up a complex timeline on the wall screen. "Eleanor has provided us with a comprehensive history of asset movements dating back nearly 2 years. What we're seeing isn't just a husband moving money before a divorce. It's a systematic attempt to defraud both a spouse and potentially the tax authorities." The timeline displayed on the screen told the story more clearly than words could. A pattern of escalating financial maneuvers, each designed to obscure ownership and value. Accounts opened in tax havens, properties transferred to shell companies, investment portfolios gradually shifted to offshore entities. And running alongside this financial timeline was another: late nights at the office, unexplained business trips, passwords changed on joint accounts, increasingly limited access to financial information. "The narrative is compelling," Judge Anderson observed. "But what makes this case unique, Mrs. Harrington, is your countermeasures. I've never seen such thorough documentation from the disadvantaged spouse." I smiled slightly at his choice of words. I was never the disadvantaged spouse, Judge. Richard just thought I was. For the next hour, we reviewed the filings prepared by Vivian's team. The divorce petition with its detailed financial disclosures, the emergency motion to freeze specified accounts, the supporting documentation of asset transfers, and, most importantly, the evidence of my prior ownership claims to specific properties and accounts. The Nantucket property transfer is particularly elegant, Marie noted with professional admiration. Since you were listed as the managing member of the LLC, your restructuring of the ownership falls within your legal authority. Mr. Harrington's signature on the original operating agreement gives him very little recourse. He never read the operating agreement, I said. He just signed where the lawyer indicated. Richard always considered legal documents beneath his attention, unless they involved nine-figure transactions. Vivian's smile was razor-thin. His oversight, our advantage. As we concluded the review, Vivian fixed me with her penetrating gaze. The papers will be filed electronically within the hour. The emergency petition for the asset freeze should be granted by end of day, given the evidence of active transfers. By the time Richard lands tomorrow, his financial maneuverability will be severely restricted. I nodded, feeling a curious mix of emotions. Resolution, certainly, but also a distant sadness for what had been lost. Not just the marriage, which had been hollow for years, but the person I had once believed Richard to be. What happens after the filing? I asked. Richard will be served immediately upon entering U.S. jurisdiction, Vivian explained. Given the nature of the filings, his accounts will be frozen before he even clears customs. His attorney, assuming he's already retained one, will receive electronic notification simultaneously. And then Judge Anderson answered, his voice carrying the weight of having witnessed countless such battles. Then, Mrs. Harrington, the real war begins. Men like your husband don't surrender easily, especially when blindsided. He will fight, he will threaten, he may even try to negotiate, but with the documentation you've provided, his options will be severely limited. I absorbed this, feeling strangely calm. I'm prepared for that. As I left Vivian's office 30 minutes later, Boston's financial district was alive with the energy of lunchtime. Men and women in expensive suits hurried along the sidewalks, phones pressed to ears, ambitions driving them forward. I had once been one of them before becoming Mrs. Richard Harrington. Tomorrow I would take the first step toward becoming Eleanor Blackwell once again. My name, my identity, my life. The cost had been high, years lost, trust shattered, innocence abandoned. But as I walked through the crisp autumn air, I couldn't help but feel that what I had gained, wisdom, strength, and the fierce knowledge of my own capabilities, might ultimately prove worth the price. After leaving Vivian's office, I found myself walking toward the public garden instead of returning directly home. I needed space to think, to breathe before the machinery we'd set in motion began its inexorable process. The garden was alive with early autumn colors, trees just beginning their transition from green to gold. I found an empty bench near the lagoon and sat watching a swan glide across the water's surface, serene above, furiously paddling below. An apt metaphor for my marriage, particularly these last 2 years. The first warning sign had been so small, I nearly missed it. A dinner reservation confirmation that arrived in our shared email account. Not unusual in itself, except this was for Menon, Richard's favorite restaurant, on a night when he was supposedly in New York. I hadn't mentioned it. Instead, I checked his calendar and noted the discrepancy, a tiny data point that meant nothing in isolation. 2 weeks later, there was another, a credit card charge for a hotel in Providence on a Tuesday night. Richard had claimed to be working late, coming home after midnight with the distant, distracted air I had come to recognize as his important deal demeanor. Again, I said nothing, just noted the inconsistency and continued watching. It wasn't that I suspected an affair, not at first. Richard's devotion had always been to his career, his status, his financial achievements. Women had always been attracted to him. his confidence, his seemingly effortless success, but his vanity had generally been satisfied with their attention rather than their company. The third sign had been the most telling. I had been looking for a tax document in his home office, with his knowledge and permission, when I found a brochure for private banking services in Singapore. The brochure itself wasn't unusual. Richard received such materials constantly. What caught my attention was the handwritten note on the back listing account numbers and contact information. I had photographed it with my phone and replaced it exactly as I'd found it. That evening, I used Richard's laptop while he was showering, a routine he never varied, 15 minutes precisely, and found emails confirming the establishment of a new account. The initial transfer had been $250,000, described as personal investment fund. We had no joint investment strategy that included Singapore banking, no discussions about diversifying our holdings internationally beyond what Blackridge already managed. This was something separate, something deliberately kept from me. That night, I had lain awake beside him, listening to his steady breathing, and made a decision. Instead of confrontation, I would choose investigation. Instead of accusation, I would pursue knowledge. My training as a forensic accountant had taught me that financial trails, when properly followed, revealed truths that words often obscured. The next morning, I had called Catherine. "I need your perspective," I had told her over coffee in a cafe far from our usual haunts. As a sister and as an attorney, Catherine had listened without interruption as I outlined what I had discovered. The discrepancies, the hidden account, the pattern of small deceptions. It could be nothing, she had offered, though her expression suggested she believed otherwise. Midlife crisis, maybe? Secret present for your anniversary. I had smiled at her attempt to offer an innocent explanation. Our anniversary was 3 months ago, and Richard doesn't do surprises unless they benefit his image. She had nodded, the attorney and her taking over. "So, what do you want to do?" "I want to know what I'm dealing with before I decide how to respond." That conversation had been the catalyst. Within a week, I had established a secure email account, opened a safe deposit box at a bank Richard didn't use, and begun systematically documenting our financial landscape, both what I knew and what I suspected. The fourth warning sign had appeared a month later. Richard had asked me, with studied casualness, what I thought about moving some of our investments into more privacy-oriented structures. When I asked for clarification, he had launched into a practice speech about asset protection, liability concerns, and the increasingly volatile global market. "It's just prudent planning," he had explained, refilling his wineglass. "Everyone at my level does it." I had nodded thoughtfully, asking just enough questions to seem interested, but not enough to suggest suspicion. "Whatever you think is best," I had told him. "You know I trust your judgment on these matters." The relief in his eyes had been unmistakable and damning. A week later, I hired Vivian Park. I hadn't begun with the intention of divorce. Truth be told, I wasn't certain what I was preparing for. Protection, perhaps, or leverage if Richard's financial maneuvering proved to be preparation for leaving me. Vivian had been clear-eyed in her assessment. In my experience, she had told me during our first meeting, men who begin hiding assets are planning one of 3 things: leaving their wives, financial crime, or both. "What would you suggest?" I had asked. "Document everything, follow every financial thread, establish your own security, and decide what you want the end result to be." What did I want? The question had haunted me in the months that followed. Did I want to save my marriage? Did I want retribution? Or did I simply want what was rightfully mine? Not just financially, but the dignity of not being played for a fool. The 5th warning sign had been the most painful. In March, on a rare weekend, when Richard was actually home, I had found him in his office on the phone, speaking in the low, intimate tone he had once reserved for me. "It's complicated," he had said to whoever was on the other end. "These things take time if they're done properly." "No, she doesn't suspect anything." I know, just a little longer." I had retreated silently, my heart hammering in my chest, That night, I had accessed his phone while he slept and found the evidence I had both expected and dreaded. A series of messages to someone named Alessandra, communications that left little about the nature of their relationship. Interspersed with the personal messages were discussions about future plans, references to "after everything is settled," and mentions of living arrangements in Singapore. I had replaced the phone on his nightstand and gone to the guest bathroom, where I quietly vomited until my stomach was empty. Not from the revelation of infidelity, but from the magnitude of betrayal it represented. Richard wasn't just planning to leave. He was orchestrating a complete extraction from our life together, one that would leave me financially and emotionally devastated. The next morning, I had called Vivian and authorized her to begin preparing divorce filings, not for immediate use, but to have ready when needed. Then I had accelerated my own preparations, shifting from documentation to active countermeasures. The most telling warning sign had been one Richard never knew he'd given. In late April, he had hosted a dinner party for several colleagues from Blackridge. After too many scotches, the conversation had turned to a recent high-profile divorce in their industry. "Poor bastard didn't know what hit him," one of Richard's colleagues had commented. "Wife's attorneys took him to the cleaners." Richard had smiled that particular smile that never reached his eyes. The mistake was being obvious. If you're going to make a significant life change, the key is preparation and discretion. Handle the finances first, establish your position, then execute. The others had laughed, taking it as generic business wisdom rather than specific personal planning. But I had heard the conviction in his voice, seen the calculation in his eyes. He hadn't been speaking hypothetically. He had been describing his own strategy. The swan in the lagoon had now been joined by its mate, both of them gliding across the water surface in perfect synchronicity. I checked my watch. The legal filings would be complete by now, moving through the system with the inexorable force of justice finally set in motion. I stood, smoothing down my skirt and taking one last look at the peaceful scene before me. In less than 24 hours, Richard would land in Boston, expecting to find his life proceeding according to his careful plan. Instead, he would discover that all his warning signs had been seen, all his signals interpreted, all his moves countered. The thought didn't bring me joy, but it did bring a sense of rightness, of balance restored to a world that had tilted too far in the direction of deception. After the garden, I returned to our penthouse and headed straight for the spare bedroom that had become my de facto command center. To anyone else, the housekeeper, Richard's occasional colleagues who visited, it appeared to be nothing more than a tastefully decorated guest room. The evidence of my counter-operation was hidden in plain sight: legal books that Richard would never touch, financial journals he would dismiss as beneath his expertise, and a locked cabinet that ostensibly held family heirlooms but actually contained my most sensitive documentation. I unlocked the cabinet and spread my materials across the bed, a queen-sized surface that offered more space than any desk. My strategic assessment had begun 11 months ago, shortly after hiring Vivian, and had evolved into a comprehensive battle plan that addressed every aspect of Richard's likely strategy. First had been the asset inventory. I had created a complete catalogue of everything we owned jointly or separately: real estate, investment accounts, retirement funds, art collections, vehicles, and even Richard's carefully curated wine cellar. For each asset, I documented the acquisition date, source of funds, title holders, and current location. This baseline had been essential for tracking Richard's subsequent movements. The most complex element had been the offshore structures Richard had established, a web of entities across multiple jurisdictions: Singapore, Cayman Islands, Isle of Man, and Delaware. The ownership chains were deliberately convoluted, designed to obscure the ultimate beneficial owner. He had initially created these for tax efficiency, but their structure made them perfect vehicles for hiding marital assets. I had mapped each entity using my forensic accounting background, creating a flowchart that would have impressed Richard's own financial engineers. The key vulnerability I identified was Richard's assumption that I didn't understand these structures. that their complexity alone would deter me from following the money. The second component of my assessment had been Richard himself. After 15 years of marriage, I knew his patterns, his blind spots, his psychological triggers. Richard's greatest weakness was his absolute conviction in his own brilliance. He believed himself to be the smartest person in any room, including, perhaps especially, rooms filled with other financial strategists. This hubris created predictable behaviors. He would transfer assets gradually, rather than all at once, believing incremental movements would go unnoticed. He would leave contingency reserves in multiple locations, never fully committing to a single strategy. He would use trusted lieutenants rather than direct action when possible, maintaining plausible deniability. And above all, he would never imagine that I, the wife he had systematically underestimated for 15 years, would not only understand his strategy, but could formulate a superior counter-strategy. The third element had been the legal landscape. With Vivian's guidance, I had studied Massachusetts divorce law in detail, understanding how courts typically handled high-net-worth cases. The Commonwealth was an equitable distribution state, not a community property state, which gave judges significant discretion in asset division. Richard was counting on his ability to hide assets before filing. What he hadn't anticipated was that the same laws that gave judges discretion also allowed them to impose severe penalties for hiding assets. Most crucially, I had assessed the timing. Richard operated on predictable cycles: quarterly business reviews, annual bonuses, tax filing seasons. By tracking his patterns for months, I had identified his most likely windows for action. The Singapore trip had been the clearest indicator. He always conducted his most sensitive financial business in person, away from potential domestic scrutiny. At the heart of my assessment had been a fundamental question: what did I actually want? Not just as a reaction to Richard's betrayal, but as a positive vision for my own future. This question had required the most difficult soul-searching. I didn't want revenge, not exactly. Revenge would keep me tethered to Richard, to the pain and betrayal. What I wanted was justice, financial and emotional. I wanted to emerge from this marriage with my fair share of our assets, yes, but more importantly with my dignity and self-respect intact. I wanted Richard to face consequences, not because I needed to see him suffer, but because actions should have consequences. Without them, there is no moral order to the world. My strategic assessment had concluded with 3 primary objectives. First, secure my financial future by protecting my rightful share of our marital assets. This meant not just preserving what was currently in our joint names, but reclaiming what Richard had already hidden. Second, ensure that Richard's attempts to defraud me were fully documented and exposed, not just to me, but to the relevant legal and financial authorities. His actions weren't just personally betraying, many crossed into legally questionable territory. Third, reclaim my professional identity and personal autonomy. The years with Richard had slowly eroded my sense of self. Whatever happened with the divorce, I needed to emerge as Eleanor Blackwell, not as Richard Harrington's ex-wife. With these objectives established, I had developed specific tactics for each category of assets. For real estate, I had leveraged my position as trustee or managing member to restructure ownership. For financial accounts, I had established parallel structures to redirect funds. For personal property, I had created comprehensive inventories with appraisals. And for Richard's hidden assets, I had developed legal strategies to freeze and reclaim them. The most elegant element of my plan, the one that gave me a quiet sense of satisfaction, was that I had accomplished most of this using the very tools and structures Richard himself had created. The offshore entities, the complex ownership chains, the privacy provisions, all of them now worked in my favor rather than his. I gathered the papers and returned them to the locked cabinet. The assessment phase had ended months ago. Now we were in the execution phase, with Richard unknowingly playing his assigned role perfectly. His email, his transfers to the Cayman accounts, each step he took further solidified my position. Tomorrow, when he landed at Logan, the carefully constructed financial fortress he thought would protect him would instead become his prison. Everything was in place. All that remained was to watch the strategy unfold. That evening, I ordered dinner from an upscale Italian restaurant near our penthouse. Richard's favorite linguine with white clam sauce, though he wasn't there to enjoy it. A small indulgence to mark the transition from preparation to action. As I ate at our dining table, with its sweeping views of Boston Harbor, I reviewed the phases of my action plan, each step now irreversibly in motion. Phase 1 had begun 9 months ago with what I called financial reconnaissance. Using the power of attorney Richard had given me years earlier, intended for handling household matters during his frequent business trips, I had systematically accessed records for every account, property, and investment vehicle in our portfolio, not to make changes, not yet, but to document the baseline before Richard began his maneuvering. This phase had required extreme caution. I reviewed accounts only from secure computers outside our home, using VPN to mask my digital footprint. I collected physical statements only when Richard was traveling, storing them in my safe deposit box rather than bringing them home. I kept meticulous logs of every access, ensuring I could prove I had legal authority for each inquiry. The most challenging aspect had been maintaining normalcy. I continued to play the role Richard expected, the supportive, somewhat financially naive wife who trusted his expertise implicitly. I attended charity galas on his arm, hosted dinner parties for his colleagues, maintained the lifestyle that complemented his professional image, all while systematically preparing to dismantle the financial structures he had built. Phase 2 had begun 6 months ago, strategic repositioning. This phase had required precise timing and flawless execution. Starting with our smallest, least frequently monitored accounts, I had begun restructuring ownership and access. For joint accounts, I established parallel individual accounts and gradually transferred portions of the balances. Never enough to trigger Richard's attention, but enough to create a financial foundation independent of his control. For real estate, I had leveraged my position as either co-owner or trustee to modify ownership structures. The Nantucket property had been the most complex, requiring multiple legal maneuvers executed through the Delaware LLC. The penthouse had been simpler, as Richard had placed it in a revocable trust for tax purposes. A trust that named me as successor trustee with broad discretionary powers. The most satisfying element had been the art collection. Richard had acquired pieces not from passion, but as investments and status symbols. Using my background in asset valuation, I had arranged for several pieces to be reappraised, documented their true market value, and established clear provenance records. When the divorce filings became public, these records would ensure every piece was properly accounted for in the marital estate. Phase 3 had been defensive positioning, establishing legal and financial safeguards against Richard's inevitable retaliation. I had opened accounts at institutions where Richard had no relationships, established credit in my maiden name, secured new identification documents, and created secure communication channels that Richard couldn't access or monitor. I had also prepared documentation of Richard's financial and personal misconduct, not for leverage or blackmail, but as insurance against his likely attempts to paint me as vindictive or unstable. The evidence included records of his affair with Alessandra, documentation of potentially improper financial transactions, and proof of his deliberate attempts to hide marital assets. The most critical element of Phase 3 had been cultivating the right professional relationships. Beyond Vivian and her legal team, I had established connections with financial advisors, real estate professionals, and security consultants, all completely separate from Richard's networks, all ready to assist when the conflict became public. Phase 4, active countermeasures, had begun just 8 weeks ago when Richard's preparations for divorce became unmistakable. The frequency of funds moving offshore had increased. His absences had become longer and less explained. Password changes and restricted access had become routine. He had begun casual conversations about simplifying our lives and downsizing now that we're older. Transparent attempts to prepare me for the diminished lifestyle he planned to leave me with. My countermeasures had been comprehensive and precisely targeted. For each offshore transfer Richard made, I executed a corresponding legal strategy to document and ultimately reclaim those funds. For each account he restricted, I established legal claims that would freeze those assets once the divorce was filed. For each property he attempted to shield, I created documentation establishing my contribution to its acquisition and maintenance. The final phase, execution, had begun this morning with Richard's email and would culminate tomorrow when he landed in Boston to find his carefully constructed financial extraction plan in shambles. As I finished my dinner, I received a text from Vivian. All filings complete. Emergency freezes granted on Cayman accounts. Service arranged for tomorrow at Logan Terminal E, 2:30 p.m. I responded with a simple, "Thank you," and set my phone aside. The machinery was now fully in motion. Richard would be served with divorce papers the moment he cleared customs. The accounts he had spent months moving offshore would be frozen before he could access them. The properties he thought securely hidden behind corporate structures would be subject to court oversight. And the woman he had dismissed as financially naive would be revealed as his equal, perhaps his superior, in strategic thinking. I cleared my dinner plate and walked to the wall of windows overlooking the city. Lights twinkled across the harbor. Boats moved silently through the darkness. Life continued its endless flow. Tomorrow would bring conflict, perhaps even chaos. But tonight there was just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that after months of secret preparation, justice was finally being set in motion. The action plan was complete. All that remained was to watch it unfold. The morning of Richard's return dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the penthouse windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. I had slept surprisingly well, waking refreshed and focused. Today would be the culmination of nearly a year of hidden maneuvers, carefully orchestrated actions that had taken place in the shadows of our marriage. I made coffee and carried it to the terrace, watching the city come alive below. In a few hours, Richard's plane would land and everything would change. Now, in this moment of calm before the storm, I allowed myself to reflect on the most intricate aspects of my counter-strategy. The moves that had happened entirely out of Richard's sight. The first hidden maneuver had been establishing my shadow financial identity. While maintaining my visible presence as Mrs. Richard Harrington, I had simultaneously reconstructed Eleanor Blackwell's independent financial existence. This hadn't been a simple matter of opening new accounts. It had required rebuilding my credit history, establishing banking relationships, and creating legitimate income streams that couldn't be traced to or controlled by Richard. I had leveraged my dormant consulting credentials to secure several discreet advisory contracts with firms that had no connection to Richard's network. The income wasn't substantial compared to our marital assets, but it created a paper trail of professional activity that would support my post-divorce financial independence. More importantly, it re-established my professional identity after years of Richard subtly but persistently diminishing my expertise. The second hidden maneuver had been the metadata strategy. I had recognized early that documentation alone wouldn't be sufficient. Timing and authenticity would be crucial. For every significant document, I had created a verifiable digital trail, emails with timestamps, electronic signatures with blockchain verification, cloud storage with access logs. Each piece of evidence had redundant authentication that would withstand the inevitable challenges from Richard's attorneys. For physical documents, I had employed a licensed notary who kept meticulous records of every certification. Bank statements, property records, asset transfers, all had been properly witnessed and documented. I had even gone so far as to have certain critical conversations recorded in two-party consent situations, creating an undeniable record of Richard's own statements about our financial affairs. The most delicate hidden maneuver had been navigating international banking regulations. Richard had chosen his offshore jurisdictions carefully, selecting countries with strong privacy laws and limited cooperation with US authorities. What he hadn't anticipated was that I would use these same privacy protections as a shield for my own financial maneuvers. Working with specialists in international finance law, I had identified specific regulatory triggers that would force disclosure of Richard's hidden accounts. For assets in Singapore, this meant documenting potential violations of their strict financial regulations. For the Cayman accounts, it meant establishing clear evidence that the transfers were made specifically to hide marital assets, a distinction that negated certain privacy protections under their banking laws. Perhaps the most satisfying hidden maneuver had been the redirection of Richard's own network. Over 15 years of marriage, I had built relationships with many of the same financial professionals, attorneys, and business associates that Richard relied upon. While he assumed these connections were merely social, the wife being polite to her husband's colleagues, I had cultivated them with purpose. Several key figures in Richard's professional orbit had quietly provided critical information and assistance. His executive assistant, Caroline, whom he had consistently undervalued and underpaid, had been particularly helpful in tracking his movements and communications. His longtime accountant, increasingly uncomfortable with some of Richard's more aggressive tax strategies, had offered subtle but valuable insights into potential vulnerabilities in his financial structures. Even Richard's personal banker at First Boston Trust, a woman who had endured years of his condescension, had ensured that certain transactions received the appropriate regulatory scrutiny. None of these allies had violated any professional ethics. They had simply ensured that rules were followed and proper documentation maintained, exactly the things Richard had grown accustomed to, circumventing through charm and intimidation. The most technically complex hidden maneuver had been tracing the money through the labyrinth of shell companies and trusts Richard had established. This had required sophisticated forensic accounting techniques, including relationship mapping, beneficial ownership analysis, and transaction pattern recognition. For months, I had reconstructed the flow of our marital assets as Richard gradually moved them into increasingly obscure structures. The breakthrough had come when I identified a recurring pattern in his methodology. Richard, for all his financial sophistication, was a creature of habit. He used the same naming conventions for his entities, the same timing for his transfers, and the same structuring techniques to avoid reporting thresholds. Once I recognized these patterns, tracking the money became substantially easier. What Richard could never have anticipated was that I had learned from him, absorbed his techniques, his strategies, his blind spots, and then improved upon them. While he had been teaching me about financial structures as intellectual exercises over the years, I had been analyzing not just the information, but how Richard himself operated within these systems. The final hidden maneuver, executed just 3 days ago, had been the most audacious. Using the power of attorney that Richard had never rescinded, I had submitted updated financial disclosures to several of our joint credit accounts. These disclosures, completely accurate but newly comprehensive, had triggered automatic compliance reviews that effectively froze several lines of credit that Richard had planned to access upon his return. He would discover, upon attempting to use these resources, that they required additional verification processes that would take days or weeks to complete. By then, the divorce filings would be public, and these assets would be under court supervision. I finished my coffee and checked my watch. Richard's plane would be landing in 4 hours. I had one final appointment before then, a meeting with my financial advisor to review the status of my newly independent portfolio. After that, I would return home to await the inevitable call that would come once Richard was served with the divorce papers. Everything was in place. Every hidden maneuver had been executed flawlessly. The chess pieces were arranged exactly as I needed them to be, though Richard still believed he was the only one moving them across the board. I went inside to dress for my meeting, selecting a slate blue suit I had purchased recently, something Richard had never seen, something that belonged solely to Eleanor Blackwell rather than Mrs. Richard Harrington. Today marked the end of hidden maneuvers. From this point forward, everything would be in the open, and Richard would finally see me clearly for perhaps the first time in our marriage. To understand Richard Harrington fully, to comprehend why he believed his plan would succeed, required acknowledging the forces that had shaped him and the world that had consistently rewarded his particular brand of calculated self-interest. As I waited for his plane to land, I reviewed what I knew about the antagonist in this drama and the advantages he believed he possessed. Richard had been raised in Connecticut affluence, the only son of a banking executive father and a socially ambitious mother. From childhood, he had been taught that the world operated according to certain unwritten rules. Appearance mattered more than substance. Networks were currency, more valuable than money itself. And most importantly, power belonged to those bold enough to seize it without apology. He had excelled at Princeton not through academic brilliance, but through strategic relationship building. His fraternity connections had secured his first position at Goldman Sachs, where he had quickly developed a reputation for aggressive deal-making. By 35, when we met, he had already moved through 3 increasingly prestigious firms, each transition representing not just a higher salary, but an expansion of his influence within Boston's financial elite. Richard's professional methodology was consistent across all aspects of his life. He identified objectives, assessed resources, eliminated obstacles, and executed without hesitation or remorse. This approach had built his career, shaped our marriage, and now fueled his extraction strategy. He believed himself to be a master tactician, several moves ahead of everyone around him, particularly his wife. The forces supporting Richard's divorce strategy were substantial. First was his financial leverage, access to liquid capital that most people, including many high-net-worth individuals, simply didn't have. Moving millions across international boundaries required resources, connections, and expertise that represented significant barriers to most divorce counter-strategies. Second was his professional network. Attorneys who specialized in asset protection, bankers with discretion as their primary product, financial managers who operated in regulatory gray areas. These weren't just service providers, they were collaborators in a system designed to shield wealth from taxation, regulation, and divorce courts. Richard had spent decades cultivating these relationships, positioning himself as both client and peer. Third was his psychological advantage, or what he perceived as his advantage. Richard genuinely believed that I lacked both the financial sophistication and the emotional fortitude to challenge him effectively. He had spent our marriage subtly reinforcing this perception, explaining financial concepts to me as if I were a particularly bright child, praising my intuitive understanding while dismissing my professional training as theoretical rather than practical. This systematic underestimation had been his most significant miscalculation. He had confused my patience for passivity, my observation for obliviousness, my strategic silence for submission. The fortress of superiority he had built around himself had become a prison that prevented him from seeing me clearly. There were other antagonistic forces at work beyond Richard himself. The legal system, despite significant progress, still favored those with greater resources to sustain prolonged litigation. The financial industry had built elaborate structures specifically designed to obscure ownership and frustrate asset discovery. International jurisdictional complexity created opportunities for those seeking to hide wealth from spouses, creditors, or tax authorities. Richard was counting on all these forces as he executed his plan. He anticipated that I would eventually secure legal representation, perhaps even competent representation. But he believed the structural advantages were too great to overcome. The combination of hidden assets, jurisdictional hurdles, and his superior resources would, in his calculation, result in a settlement far below what Massachusetts law theoretically guaranteed me. The most powerful antagonist force, however, was confidence. Richard's absolute certainty in his own superior strategic thinking. This certainty had been reinforced throughout his life by a system that rewarded exactly his type of calculated self-interest. He had never faced meaningful consequences for his actions, professional or personal. He had navigated around obstacles rather than through them. abandoned positions that became untenable, and consistently emerged with his wealth and status intact. This pattern of success had created a kind of invulnerability field around him, a belief system in which failure was simply not a possibility that needed to be seriously considered. In psychological terms, it was a form of narcissistic optimization, the conviction that the world would inevitably bend to accommodate his will because it always had before. Richard's specific divorce strategy leveraged all these advantages. The timeline had likely been in development for at least 18 months, beginning with the establishment of the Singapore banking relationships and accelerating after his introduction to Alessandra, the investment banker from his London office, who had become both his romantic partner and his financial collaborator. His plan's elegance lay in its graduated approach. The first phase had been asset assessment and categorization, identifying which of our marital assets were most vulnerable to discovery and division. The second phase had been strategic restructuring, moving assets into vehicles that obscured ownership while maintaining his effective control. The third phase had been jurisdictional distribution, spreading assets across multiple legal systems to complicate recovery efforts. The final phase, which he had initiated with his email, was meant to be the triumphant execution, the clean break that would leave him with the majority of our wealth and me with whatever remnants were too visible or too entangled to extract cleanly. What made Richard truly dangerous was not just his resources or his network, but his adaptability. When obstacles appeared, he adjusted. When strategies proved ineffective, he abandoned them without sentiment and developed alternatives. He operated according to a pure cost-benefit analysis, unencumbered by emotional attachment to particular approaches or outcomes beyond the bottom line. If his offshore strategy failed, he would attempt to negotiate a settlement that preserved his core assets. If negotiation failed, he would pursue litigation designed to exhaust my resources and resolve. If litigation became unfavorable, he would seek to move assets beyond the court's practical reach, calculating that enforcement costs would eventually lead me to accept less than my full entitlement. The antagonist forces aligned against me were formidable, representing not just one man's determination, but an entire system designed to protect wealth from division. Richard was merely an exceptionally adept navigator of this system, a player who understood the rules of the game and had positioned his pieces accordingly. What he didn't know, what would become apparent in the coming hours, was that while he had been playing chess, I had been playing a different game entirely. He had been moving pieces across the board, according to traditional patterns, while I had been rewriting the fundamental rules of engagement. I checked the flight tracker on my phone. Richard's plane had landed 20 minutes early. He would be moving through customs now, anticipating a car service to bring him home to the penthouse where he expected to find me, perhaps distraught over his email, perhaps already contacting attorneys, but certainly not prepared for what was actually unfolding. I sent a text to Vivian. "The plane has landed." Her response was immediate. "Process server in position." "You're sure about the in-person service?" We could have done this more discreetly. I considered the question one final time. There were indeed more discreet options. Service at the penthouse, electronic notification to his attorneys, even waiting until tomorrow to execute the final step. But after months of operating in the shadows, after years of being underestimated and dismissed, I had made a deliberate choice for this moment to be witnessed, to be public, to be undeniable. "I'm sure," I replied. "Some moments should be memorable." I set my phone down and waited for the call that would signal the beginning of the end, not just of my marriage, but of Richard's illusion of invulnerability. The antagonist forces were powerful, but they were about to collide with a reality they had never anticipated. A woman who had learned to use their own systems against them. The call came at 2:43 p.m. I had been sitting in my living room, reviewing final documentation with Marie when Richard's name illuminated my phone screen. I met Marie's eyes and she nodded, gathering her papers and quietly moving to the guest room to give me privacy. This conversation needed to happen without witnesses, at least on my end. I let it ring 3 times, collecting myself. then answered with a simple, "Hello, Richard." The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to confirm that something had gone dramatically wrong in his carefully constructed world. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tension I had rarely heard, controlled fury underlaid with genuine shock. "What the hell have you done?" Each word was precisely enunciated, as if maintaining verbal composure might somehow restore order to his unraveling plans. "I'm not sure what you mean," I replied, my voice steady. "I just received some rather interesting legal papers myself. Perhaps we're having similar days." Another pause, this one briefer. I could almost see him recalibrating, shifting from indignation to calculation. "This is unnecessary, Eleanor. Whatever you think you're doing, we can resolve this privately, like rational adults." "That's an interesting perspective," I said, "considering your 3 a.m. email informing me that you had emptied our accounts and moved everything offshore. Was that your idea of a private, rational resolution?" "That was..." He stopped himself. Richard rarely made verbal mistakes, and he certainly didn't admit to them. "You're misinterpreting a contingency plan. I was stress testing our financial security." I almost laughed at the audacity. A contingency plan that coincidentally included filing for divorce and moving to Singapore with your colleague Alessandra. That's quite thorough scenario planning, Richard. Did the contingency also require cancelling my credit cards and transferring the Nantucket property to your shell company? The sharp intake of breath on the other end confirmed that my intelligence had surprised him. He hadn't expected this level of specific knowledge. "You've been going through my private communications." Accusation had replaced shock, a calculated attempt to shift the moral high ground. "No," I corrected. "I've been documenting your systematic attempt to hide marital assets in anticipation of divorce. There's a significant legal distinction." "The distinction," he said, his voice hardening, "is that I've spent 20 years building our financial position while you've played at being a corporate wife. Whatever you think you're entitled to..." "Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state," I interrupted, "and I have 15 years of evidence documenting my contributions to our marital estate, including the strategic sacrifices of my own career to support yours. But we both know this isn't really about legal entitlements, is it, Richard?" He was silent, waiting for me to continue, probably recording the conversation for his attorneys. I didn't mind. Everything I said was precisely calibrated. "This is about you believing you could discard me like an underperforming investment," I continued, "that you could extract maximum value while minimizing your costs, the same approach you've applied to every relationship in your life." "That's a creative interpretation," he said, his voice cooler now, more controlled. "But you've made a serious tactical error. The assets you're attempting to freeze are largely outside US jurisdiction. The accounts in Singapore have already been flagged for compliance review based on documentation I provided to the Monetary Authority of Singapore 2 weeks ago," I finished for him. "The transfers to Cayman triggered automatic regulatory scrutiny under the recent amendments to the Financial Action Task Force recommendations and the Delaware LLC that supposedly owns our Nantucket property. Its operating agreement gives me unilateral authority as managing member, a position I've held since you registered it 5 years ago." The silence that followed was different, heavier, charged with the dawning realization that he wasn't simply facing an inconvenient legal challenge, but a comprehensive dismantling of his entire strategy. "How did you..." he began, then stopped himself. Another recalibration. "These are temporary setbacks. My attorneys will have the freezes lifted by tomorrow. As for your claims about the property transfers, they're documented, witnessed, and already filed with the relevant authorities," I said. "Your attorney has probably already advised you that challenging them will only extend the discovery process, which would give us access to accounts you believe are still safely hidden." I heard muffled voices in the background. He wasn't alone, probably already meeting with his legal team at their offices rather than coming home. Good. That would make the next step easier. "Eleanor," His voice had shifted again, adopting the reasonable, slightly patronizing tone he used when negotiating. I think we both need to take a step back. Divorce is emotional, but it doesn't have to be destructive. I'm prepared to offer a very generous settlement, one that acknowledges your contributions while avoiding protracted legal battles that would only benefit our attorneys. That's thoughtful, I replied, matching his reasonable tone. And what would this generous settlement include? He outlined figures quickly: a lump sum payment, monthly support for 3 years, and the penthouse. The numbers were substantial by ordinary standards, but represented less than 20% of our actual marital assets. He was testing my knowledge, my resolve, and most importantly, my alternatives. I see, I said when he finished. And in exchange, I would withdraw the filings, release the freezes, and surrender any claims to the offshore assets. Exactly, he said, relief coloring his voice, a clean break that lets us both move forward. I let a moment pass, as if considering his offer. Then I'm afraid that won't be possible, Richard. You see, I'm not negotiating for a percentage of our assets. I'm simply ensuring that the division is truly equitable, as required by law. Don't be naive, he snapped, the reasonable facade cracking. This isn't about law, it's about leverage. And right now, you think you have it, but trust me, Eleanor, you don't want this fight. I have resources you can't imagine. No, Richard, I corrected gently. You had resources you couldn't imagine I would find. Past tense. The difference matters. I ended the call before he could respond, setting the phone down with hands that were surprisingly steady. The first confrontation had gone exactly as expected. Initial shock, followed by accusation, then attempted negotiation, and finally, thinly veiled threats. Richard would recover quickly. He would develop new strategies, deploy additional resources, and prepare for extended conflict. But for the first time in our relationship, he would do so with the unsettling knowledge that he was facing an opponent who had anticipated his every move and prepared accordingly. The balance of power had shifted, and we both knew it. After the first confrontation, events accelerated with the precise mechanistic inevitability of dominoes falling. Richard, true to his nature, refused to accept the initial setback as definitive. Within hours of our call, the escalation began, a multi-pronged counterattack designed to regain control of both the narrative and the assets. The first salvo arrived via email at 5:17 p.m. A formal communication from Bradford Winters, managing partner at Winters, Sullivan & Reed, Boston's most exclusive and expensive divorce firm. The message was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, outlining potential claims against me, ranging from breach of fiduciary duty to fraudulent misrepresentation. Each paragraph carried the unmistakable subtext: this will be expensive, exhausting, and ultimately futile. I forwarded it to Vivian without comment. She responded within minutes. Standard playbook. Ignore. At 6:02 p.m., the personal approach began. A series of text messages from Richard, each carefully calibrated to strike a specific emotional note. Eleanor, this hostility isn't like you. Let's talk in person. We had 15 good years. Does it really need to end in legal warfare? I'm concerned about your state of mind. This vindictive behavior isn't healthy. My offer still stands, but it has a time limit. After midnight, everything changes. The progression was textbook Richard. Reasonableness, nostalgia, concern trolling, and finally, thinly veiled threats. I didn't respond to any of them, which I knew would unsettle him more than any reply. Richard had always found silence intolerable. It was the one response he couldn't immediately analyze and counter. At 7:43 p.m., the social pressure began. My phone lit up with a call from Patricia Ellsworth, the self-appointed social arbiter of our circle, whose husband managed one of Richard's key investment funds. Patricia and I had maintained a cordial but distant relationship over the years. I attended her charity galas. She pretended my background was as privileged as hers. "Eleanor, darling," she gushed when I answered, as if we were intimate friends. "I've just heard the most disturbing news. Tell me it's not true that you and Richard are having difficulties." "Patricia," I replied evenly. How thoughtful of you to call. Yes, Richard and I are divorcing. Her sharp intake of breath was almost comical. But surely this can be resolved privately. Richard has been telling everyone there's been a terrible misunderstanding, that you've had some sort of breakdown. Has he? I interjected, my voice cooling. How interesting, considering he sent me an email explicitly stating he was divorcing me, had moved our assets offshore, and was relocating to Singapore with his colleague Alessandra. The silence that followed told me everything. Patricia hadn't called to offer support. She'd called to gather intelligence for Richard, to assess how firm my position was, and perhaps to convey veiled warnings about social consequences. I had no idea, she finally managed. That certainly changes things. Yes, I agreed. It certainly does. If you'll excuse me, Patricia, I have calls to return. By 9 p.m., Richard had escalated to the financial realm. My phone pinged with security alerts, attempts to access joint accounts that had already been frozen or restructured. He was testing the boundaries, looking for vulnerabilities, any financial avenue that remained open to him. At 9:34 p.m., a more serious breach was attempted. My secure email account registered multiple password reset attempts, followed by a sophisticated phishing attack designed to capture my authentication credentials. The attempts originated from an IP address in downtown Boston, almost certainly the offices of whatever security consultant Richard had engaged for digital countermeasures. I notified our cybersecurity team immediately. Anticipating exactly this type of escalation, I had retained the services of Blackwater Digital Security 3 months earlier, the same firm that protected several international banking systems. Their confirmation came quickly. Attempts blocked. Countermeasures deployed. Digital perimeter secure. At 10:17 p.m., the most predictable escalation arrived. A call from Richard's oldest friend and fraternity brother, James Carrington, now a senior partner at a prestigious Boston law firm. James had been my assigned dinner companion at countless social events over the years, his practiced charm never quite concealing his fundamental belief that wives were decorative accessories rather than full partners. "Eleanor," he began without preamble when I answered, "this has gone far enough. You need to call off your attack dogs." "Good evening, James," I replied. "I assume Richard asked you to intercede." "I'm calling as someone who cares about both of you," he said, voice dripping with insincere concern. "This scorched earth approach helps no one. Richard is prepared to be reasonable, but you're forcing him into a corner. You may not like his response." "Is that a threat, James?" "It's a reality check," he countered. "You're playing a game with rules you don't fully understand. Richard has connections that..." "That what?" I interrupted. "That could destroy me financially? Damage my reputation? Ensure I never work in this town again? Please, James, at least be original in your intimidation tactics." His voice hardened. "You've made a serious miscalculation. Richard won't just roll over because you've managed a few clever legal maneuvers. He's already speaking with regulators about potential improprieties in your financial activities." "You mean he's attempting to report me for the very actions he himself took?" I asked mildly. "That would require him to acknowledge those offshore transfers were intended to hide marital assets, an admission that would trigger additional regulatory scrutiny he can't afford." James paused, clearly not expecting this level of strategic thinking. "This isn't just about money anymore. Richard feels betrayed." "How fascinating," I said, "that Richard feels betrayed by my response to his betrayal. The psychological gymnastics are truly impressive." After ending the call with James, I poured myself a glass of wine and moved to the terrace. The night had turned cool, the city lights blinking below like earthbound stars. The escalation was proceeding exactly as I had anticipated in my strategic planning sessions with Vivian and her team. Each of Richard's countermoves had been predicted, each response prepared in advance. He was operating according to his standard playbook: legal intimidation, emotional manipulation, social pressure, financial aggression, and finally, deployment of powerful connections. It was the approach that had served him throughout his career. the systematic application of leverage against increasingly reluctant opposition, until capitulation was the only rational choice. What Richard had yet to understand was that the traditional power dynamics that had defined our marriage no longer applied. I had spent a year dismantling his financial advantage, documenting his legal vulnerabilities, and insulating myself from precisely the social and professional pressures he was now attempting to apply. My phone buzzed with a text from Vivian. Second wave of emergency motions granted. All identified offshore accounts now under judicial supervision, pending full discovery. Do you want an update call tonight or morning? Morning is fine, I replied. Everything is proceeding as expected. I finished my wine, watching the city below continue its endless rhythm, oblivious to the high-stakes battle being waged in offices and courtrooms. Tomorrow would bring new escalations, new tactics, perhaps even more desperate measures, as Richard confronted the reality that his extraction plan had not merely failed, but backfired catastrophically. For the first time in our 15-year marriage, Richard was not fighting from a position of overwhelming advantage. He was fighting from a position of increasing vulnerability against an opponent who had studied his methods, anticipated his moves, and neutralized his traditional sources of power. The escalation would continue, but its trajectory had already been irrevocably altered. Morning arrived with a clarity that matched my state of mind. I had slept deeply, waking refreshed despite the previous day's confrontations and escalations. As I prepared for my 9:01 a.m. call with Vivian, my phone buzzed with a notification, a new email from Richard's personal account, rather than through his attorney's. The timestamp showed 4:38 a.m. Either he hadn't slept, or he had woken in the darkest part of night with a new approach. I opened it cautiously, half expecting another threat or manipulation attempt. Instead, I found something more interesting, the first signs of a strategic pivot. Eleanor, he wrote, after reflection, I recognize that we've begun this process in a regrettable manner. My initial approach was inappropriate and reactive. I propose a reset, a mediated conversation with neutral third parties where we can discuss equitable division without further escalation. This benefits neither of us, and certainly not our shared legacy. I forwarded it to Vivian with a single comment. Phase 2 begins. Richard's pivot was predictable, but still fascinating to observe. Having failed with intimidation, emotional manipulation, and social pressure, he was now attempting the reasonable conciliator role, positioning himself as the mature party seeking resolution while implicitly casting me as the aggressor. This was the Richard I knew best. Adaptive, pragmatic, willing to abandon failed strategies without sentimental attachment. He had recognized that his initial approach had backfired and was now recalibrating, seeking a narrative that would preserve as much of his position as possible while appearing to take the high road. Vivian's call came precisely at 9 a.m. Good morning, she said briskly. I see Richard has discovered the virtue of reasonableness overnight. Exactly as anticipated, I replied, settling into the chair by the window. Our current position? Stronger than yesterday, she said. Judge Hernandez granted our expanded discovery motions. Richard's team now has 72 hours to provide complete documentation on all financial holdings, domestic and international. The Cayman freeze is holding despite their emergency petition for relief. Singapore accounts remain under compliance review, which effectively prevents access. And Alexandra, interesting development there. Vivian's voice carried a note of satisfaction. She appears to have returned to London last night. The ticket was purchased 3 hours after Richard was served with our filings. I smiled slightly. Alexandra's retreat was unsurprising, but still satisfying. She had signed on for the successful wealthy banker with a clean exit from his marriage, not a man embroiled in complex financial litigation with frozen assets and potential regulatory issues. How should we respond to his mediation proposal? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We acknowledge it positively while maintaining our current legal position, Vivian said. Open to dialogue while giving away nothing substantive. The standard language is in your secure folder. After the call, I reviewed the draft response Vivian had prepared weeks ago in anticipation of exactly this pivot. The language was calibrated perfectly. Professional, non-antagonistic, but maintaining firm boundaries around the discovery process and asset preservation requirements. I sent it with minor modifications, then turned my attention to my own strategic pivot. While Richard had been deploying his cascading pressure tactics yesterday, I had been quietly executing the next phase of my own strategy. With the initial legal protections in place and Richard's attention focused on regaining control of the frozen assets, I had begun the process of professional re-establishment. At 11 CSAM, I had a virtual meeting with the managing partner of Barrett Forensic Finance, a boutique firm specializing in high-net-worth financial investigations. I had interviewed with them 3 months earlier, laying the groundwork for this moment. Eleanor, Diane Barrett, greeted me, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "I've been following the filings with interest. Impressive work." "Thank you," I replied, though I should note that the matter remains in active litigation. She nodded approvingly at my discretion. "Of course. We're not discussing specifics. I'm more interested in the methodologies applied, the comprehensive offshore tracing, the regulatory triggering mechanisms. It demonstrates exactly the skill set we discussed during our previous conversations." The meeting continued for 45 minutes, ending with a formal offer to join the firm as a senior consultant once my personal matters were resolved. The position would not only re-establish my professional identity, but would strategically position me within the same financial ecosystem that Richard had assumed would automatically align against me. My second meeting at 1 p.m. represented an even more significant pivot. For years, Richard had controlled our philanthropic activities, directing funds to organizations that enhanced his professional image and social standing. The Eleanor Harrington Foundation had existed primarily as a tax vehicle, its actual charitable impact secondary to its networking utility. Now I was meeting with Julia Santos, a respected advisor in strategic philanthropy, to discuss restructuring the foundation under my maiden name with a completely different mission. "The transition is entirely viable," Julia confirmed after reviewing the foundation structure. "As the named principal director, you have full authority to redirect its activities. Mr. Harrington's role was always advisory rather than statutory." "And the existing commitments?" I asked. "Can be honored through their current cycle while new initiatives are developed," she explained. "I've drafted a transition plan that maintains relationships with worthy organizations while shifting the overall focus toward your stated priorities." My strategic pivot wasn't just about financial assets or professional positioning. It was about reclaiming and redirecting the full spectrum of resources that had been part of our marital partnership: social capital, philanthropic influence, professional networks, and perhaps most importantly, narrative control. By 3 p.m., Richard had made his next move. A carefully worded press statement provided on background to selected financial journalists. While never mentioning me by name, it positioned him as facing personal challenges while remaining fully committed to his clients and responsibilities at Blackridge Capital. The subtext was clear. This was a minor domestic distraction, not a fundamental threat to his professional standing. I had anticipated this narrative play as well. 2 months earlier, I had engaged a reputation management specialist who had quietly established relationships with key journalists in Boston's financial press. Within hours of Richard's statement, these contacts received a simple message. For context on the Harrington matter, the publicly available filings tell a more complete story than any press statement. By directing them to the actual court documents rather than offering counterspin, I ensured that any reporting would include the documented facts of Richard's attempted asset hiding and offshore transfers. The narrative would not be successful banker faces divorce, but financial executive caught attempting to hide marital assets. The most satisfying pivot came at 5 p.m. when I received confirmation that the final piece of my strategy had fallen into place. For months, I had been in discreet communication with Sandra Mitchell. a senior partner at Blackridge Capital, who had long been wary of Richard's increasingly aggressive financial strategies. Now, with the divorce filings public and the offshore accounts under scrutiny, she had convened an emergency meeting of the firm's Risk Management Committee. The committee has voted to place Richard on administrative leave pending resolution of these matters, her message read. This is not connected to your personal situation, but rather to regulatory concerns raised by the documented financial activities. This was the pivot Richard would find most devastating. The recognition that his professional standing, the core of his identity, was now in jeopardy, not because I had directly attacked it, but because his own actions, once exposed to scrutiny, could not withstand professional review. As evening arrived, I poured myself a glass of wine and reviewed the day's developments. Each aspect of my strategic pivot was now in motion: legal, professional, philanthropic, reputational, and institutional. While Richard scrambled to contain the immediate damage and salvage what assets he could, I was methodically building the foundation for a completely reconfigured future. My phone buzzed with another message from Richard. "We need to talk in person. This has gone far enough." I didn't respond immediately. His demand for a meeting wasn't driven by a desire for reconciliation, but by the recognition that his position was deteriorating rapidly. He would be seeking information, assessing my resolve, looking for any leverage point he might have missed. "I'm available to meet with our respective counsel present," I finally replied. "Vivian can coordinate with your team." Setting the phone aside, I watched the sunset paint the Boston skyline in shades of gold and crimson. The strategic pivot was complete. What had begun as Richard's attempt to extract himself and our assets from our marriage had transformed into something entirely different. My emergence from the shadows of that same marriage, not as a victim, but as an architect of a new reality neither of us had anticipated. The following morning, I awoke to a text from Catherine. "Flight landing at 10:15. See you soon." My sister had been my first and most steadfast ally throughout this process, and now she was flying in from Colorado to provide in-person support during the crucial next phase. As I prepared for the day, I reflected on the network that had sustained me through the past year, the carefully assembled support system that had made my counter-strategy possible. While Richard had always relied on transactional relationships built on mutual benefit and strategic advantage, I had cultivated connections founded on trust, respect, and shared values. Catherine arrived at the penthouse shortly before noon, wrapping me in a hug that carried the familiar scent of her jasmine perfume. At 45, 2 years my senior, she carried herself with the confident poise of a woman who had built her own successful law practice while raising 2 children as a single mother after her own divorce a decade earlier. "You look good," she said, studying my face with sisterly scrutiny. "Tired, but strong." "I feel strong," I admitted, helping her with her bag. "Stronger than I expected." Over lunch on the terrace, I updated her on the developments of the past 48 hours. Richard's escalation tactics, his subsequent pivot to reasonableness, the ongoing legal maneuvers, and my own strategic positioning. "He underestimated you catastrophically," Catherine noted, a satisfied gleam in her eye. "Men like Richard can't conceive of women as strategic equals. It's their perpetual blind spot." "It wasn't just Richard," I said. "It was the entire system he operates within. None of them saw me clearly." Catherine nodded thoughtfully, "Which is precisely why your support system was so crucial. You needed people who did see you, your capabilities, your resilience, your strategic mind." She was right. From the beginning, I had recognized that navigating this situation would require more than just legal representation or financial expertise. It would demand a comprehensive support network that could provide specialized knowledge, emotional stability, and strategic perspective. Beyond Catherine and Vivian, my inner circle included Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a psychologist specializing in high-conflict divorces who had helped me maintain emotional equilibrium throughout the process. Our weekly sessions had provided a safe space to process the anger, grief, and anxiety that accompanied the dissolution of a 15-year marriage. even one that had grown as hollow as mine and Richard's. "How are you really doing with all this?" Catherine asked, her expression softening. "The strategic part is clearly going according to plan, but emotionally?" I considered the question carefully. I'm not heartbroken in the traditional sense. What hurts most isn't losing Richard. That relationship had been fading for years. It's the realization that he never truly saw me, even after 15 years. That's the betrayal that cuts deepest. Catherine reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "His failure to see you doesn't diminish your worth. If anything, it highlights his limitations." After lunch, we were joined by Sofia Rodriguez, my financial advisor, who had helped construct the parallel banking and investment infrastructure that now formed the foundation of my independent financial identity. Unlike the advisors in Richard's orbit, who prioritized aggressive growth and tax avoidance above all else, Sophia had helped me build a balanced portfolio that reflected my own values and priorities. "The markets responded to yesterday's news," Sophia reported, pulling up data on her tablet. Blackridge stock down 3% on reports of Richard's administrative leave. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to signal investor concern. This was relevant not just for market intelligence, but because part of my settlement strategy involved Blackridge stock options that Richard had accumulated over the years. Their fluctuating value would influence both his negotiating position and the ultimate financial terms of our divorce. "What's your read on their likely response?" I asked. "The firm will prioritize stability and client confidence," Sophia assessed. "If the regulatory concerns expand or if discovery reveals additional issues, they'll distance themselves further from Richard. Their fiduciary obligations to investors will outweigh any personal loyalty." The afternoon brought another crucial member of my support system, Marcus Jenkins, the cybersecurity specialist whose team had protected my digital infrastructure from Richard's attempted incursions. Unlike the stereotype of the socially awkward tech genius, Marcus was a former FBI cybercrimes investigator with both technical expertise and strategic understanding. "We've registered continued attempts to access your accounts," he reported, his manner professional but warm. "Nothing concerning. Standard penetration testing approaches, likely from the same security firm as yesterday. Our countermeasures remain effective." "Any attempts against the documentation archives?" Catherine asked. Marcus shook his head. "The distributed storage system has proven secure. Even if they managed to compromise one location, the blockchain verification would preserve the integrity of the records." This sophisticated digital security had been Catherine's recommendation early in the process. She had seen too many divorces where critical documentation mysteriously disappeared or was altered, leaving the less technologically savvy spouse at a severe disadvantage. By evening, the final piece of my support system arrived. Maria Vasquez, my friend of 20 years who had flown in from Chicago. Unlike the professionals who provided specialized expertise, Maria offered something equally valuable: the grounding presence of someone who had known me before I became Mrs. Richard Harrington, someone who remembered Eleanor Blackwell, the forensic accountant with big dreams and uncompromising principles. Over dinner, Maria asked the question others had carefully avoided. "After all this is resolved, what do you actually want for yourself, Eleanor? Not just financially or professionally, but personally." The question caught me off guard. For so long, my focus had been on strategy, on countering Richard's moves, on securing my rightful share of our marital assets. I had given less thought to what would come after the legal battles were concluded. I began, then paused to find the words. "I want to rebuild a life that's authentically mine, not defined by Richard or by this divorce, but by my own choices and values. I want work that matters, relationships that nurture, and the freedom to evolve without constraint." Maria smiled, a look of recognition in her eyes. There she is, the Eleanor I've always known. As the evening concluded and my support team dispersed, Catherine to the guest room, the others to their respective homes or hotels, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. While Richard operated in a world of power plays and leverage, I had built something more enduring, a community of competent, ethical individuals who had contributed not just their expertise, but their genuine support to my journey. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Richard's latest message indicated he was preparing another strategic shift, likely more aggressive after the professional setback of his administrative leave. But whatever came next, I would face it not as an isolated individual, but as someone anchored in a network of support that Richard, for all his resources and connections, could not match. In this, perhaps more than any other aspect of our divorce, the fundamental difference between us was most clearly revealed. 3 days later, the moment arrived for the first face-to-face meeting between Richard and me since his fateful email. The neutral ground selected for this encounter was the conference room at Gerstein Mediation Services, a highly respected firm that specialized in high-net-worth divorce negotiations. Catherine accompanied me as additional support, though Vivian would handle all legal aspects. We arrived 15 minutes early, giving us time to settle into the space and establish a psychological advantage. The conference room was designed for precisely this type of high-stakes negotiation, tastefully decorated in muted blues and grays, with comfortable but professional seating arranged around a polished oak table. Large windows offered views of Boston Harbor, a calming backdrop to what promised to be a tense encounter. Remember, Vivian advised as we reviewed our materials, Richard will attempt to establish dominance immediately. He'll likely use familiarity, perhaps even nostalgia, to create the impression that this is still a conversation between husband and wife, rather than opposing parties in litigation. I nodded, appreciating yet again Vivian's psychological insight. And when that fails, he'll pivot to intimidation or condescension. Exactly, she confirmed. Your advantage is that you anticipate his tactics while he continues to underestimate yours. At precisely 10 a.m., the door opened. Richard entered first, followed by Bradford Winters and a younger attorney carrying multiple folders. My first impression was of subtle but definite change in Richard's appearance. The perfectly tailored suit remained, as did the expensive watch and carefully maintained haircut, but there was a tightness around his eyes, a slight stiffness in his movements that betrayed the stress of the past several days. His gaze found mine immediately, assessing, calculating. I met it directly, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply present and centered in my own authority. For a moment, genuine surprise flickered across his features. He had expected either anger or anxiety, not this calm self-possession. "Eleanor," he said, his voice projecting warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "You're looking well." "Richard," I replied with a neutral nod, offering nothing more. The mediator, David Gerson, a distinguished man in his 60s with a reputation for unflappable professionalism, called the meeting to order. "Before we begin, I want to establish ground rules. This is a facilitated negotiation, not a court proceeding. Our goal is productive dialogue that might lead toward resolution of contested issues. I'll ask that everyone maintain professional courtesy, regardless of personal feelings." The initial hour proceeded with formal presentations of positions. Bradford Winters outlined Richard's proposal, a settlement that appeared generous on first glance, but represented less than 30% of our actual marital assets. Vivian countered with our comprehensive asset inventory, including documentation of the offshore accounts, property transfers, and investment vehicles that Richard had attempted to conceal. Throughout this exchange, Richard maintained a facade of attentive professionalism, though I noted the subtle tells that signaled his growing frustration. The slight tapping of his finger against his thigh, the occasional tightening of his jaw. He had expected this meeting to be an opportunity to establish control over the negotiation process. Instead, it was becoming increasingly apparent that his position was fundamentally compromised. After the formal presentations, David suggested a brief recess. As the others stepped out, Richard made his move, approaching me directly. "This isn't necessary," he said quietly, voice pitched for my ears alone. "We built something valuable together, Eleanor. Do you really want to see it destroyed by attorneys who profit from conflict?" I regarded him steadily. What we built was dismantled the moment you began hiding assets and planning your exit strategy, Richard. This isn't about emotion or retribution. It's simply about equitable division of what we created together. His expression hardened slightly. You've made your point. I underestimated you. But this path you're taking, freezing accounts, involving regulators, damaging my professional standing, it hurts you as much as it hurts me. The longer this drags on, the more our combined assets will diminish. That's a perspective, I acknowledged. Another is that accountability isn't something to be avoided but embraced. If our assets diminish because you attempted to hide them through legally questionable means, that's not a failure of my strategy, but a consequence of yours. Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice further. What do you actually want, Eleanor? Beyond the money? Beyond making your point? Because whatever it is, we can negotiate directly. Cut out the attorneys, the mediators, all of this theater. I recognized the tactic immediately, an attempt to re-establish our former dynamic, where Richard made the real decisions while creating the illusion of joint consideration. It might have worked mere months ago, when I was still accustomed to deferring to his financial expertise. What I want, I replied evenly, is already documented in our filings. Equitable division of assets, transparent accounting of all holdings, and acknowledgement of my contributions to our marital estate. Nothing more, nothing less. Frustration flickered across his face. This isn't you. The Eleanor I know isn't vindictive. Someone's gotten to you. Your sister, that shark of an attorney. They're pushing you toward conflict that serves their interests, not yours. I'd be happy to help you rewrite this text while maintaining its original structure, narrative style, emotional tone and length. I'll focus on correcting spelling mistakes, grammar errors, and improving awkward phrasing. Expertise, what I want, I replied evenly, is already documented in our filings. Equitable division of assets, transparent accounting of all holdings, and acknowledgement of my contributions to our marital estate. Nothing more, nothing less. Frustration flickered across his face. This isn't you. The Eleanor I know isn't vindictive. Someone's gotten to you. Your sister, that shark of an attorney. They're pushing you toward conflict that serves their interests, not yours. I nearly smiled at the predictable attempt to drive wedges between me and my support system. The Eleanor you knew was carefully curated to meet your expectations, Richard. Perhaps what's unsettling isn't that I've changed, but that you're finally seeing aspects of me that were always there, just invisible to you. Before he could respond, the others returned to the room. The remainder of the meeting focused on procedural matters, scheduling for discovery, compliance parameters for asset valuation, and protocols for ongoing financial disclosures. Throughout these discussions, I noticed Richard becoming increasingly withdrawn, his participation more perfunctory. It wasn't until the meeting's conclusion that I understood why. As we gathered our materials, his younger attorney approached Vivian with a document. This was just filed, he said, his tone professional, but with an undercurrent of satisfaction. Mr. Harrington is petitioning for emergency relief from the asset freezes on grounds of commercial necessity. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Vivian accepted the document without reaction. We'll be there. Outside the mediation center, Catherine placed a hand on my arm. He's desperate. The administrative leave must be creating more pressure than we anticipated. It's not just the leave, I said, watching Richard's car pull away from the curb. It's the loss of control. This meeting was supposed to re-establish his dominance, to create a negotiating environment he could manipulate. Instead, it confirmed that the power dynamics have fundamentally shifted. What do you think he'll try next? She asked. I considered the question, recalling the slight shift in Richard's demeanor toward the meeting's end, the withdrawal that signaled not defeat, but recalculation. Something unexpected, I said. He realized that conventional tactics aren't working. He'll look for a vulnerability we haven't protected against, a pressure point we haven't anticipated. Vivian joined us, her expression thoughtful. I've reviewed the emergency petition. It's clever, arguing that the asset freezes are damaging not just to Richard, but to his clients and investors. creating a commercial necessity that overrides matrimonial considerations. Will it work? Catherine asked. Unlikely, Vivian replied, but that may not be its primary purpose. This could be a distraction while he maneuvers elsewhere. As we drove back to the penthouse, I felt a curious mixture of satisfaction and weariness. The confrontation had gone largely as anticipated. Richard had attempted familiarity, then negotiation, then manipulation, all without success, but his final withdrawal suggested a strategic pivot was coming, one we might not have fully anticipated. The climactic confrontation wasn't over. It had merely shifted to a new battlefield, one Richard was still selecting. But whatever came next, the fundamental truth remained unchanged. He was now reacting to my strategy rather than implementing his own. And in that crucial reversal lay my continued advantage. Richard's emergency petition was denied, as Vivian had predicted. Judge Hernandez saw through the commercial necessity argument, noting dryly in her ruling that the preservation of marital assets, pending equitable distribution, takes precedence over Mr. Harrington's desire to resume control of accounts he demonstrably attempted to shield from matrimonial proceedings. The aftermath of that ruling unfolded with a swiftness that surprised even me. Within hours, Blackridge Capital issued a terse press release extending Richard's administrative leave indefinitely and appointing an interim head for his division. By evening, financial news outlets were reporting that the SEC had opened a preliminary inquiry into certain offshore transactions flagged during the divorce proceedings. I received this news while having dinner with Catherine at a small Italian restaurant in the North End, far from the upscale establishments Richard and I had frequented during our marriage. The quiet family-owned place, with its red-checkered tablecloths and handwritten menus, represented the kind of authentic experience Richard had always dismissed as quaint but unnecessary. "Are you concerned about potential blowback?" Catherine asked as we shared a bottle of Barolo. "If the SEC investigation expands, it could affect the valuation of assets you're entitled to." I considered the question thoughtfully. I'm prepared for that possibility. The documentation we provided was legally required. We didn't volunteer anything beyond what the court mandated. If Richard's financial maneuvers can't withstand regulatory scrutiny, that's a consequence of his choices, not mine. The waiter brought our pasta, the rich aroma of truffle and sage rising from the handmade tortellini. After he'd gone, Catherine leaned forward. "I've been watching you these past days," she said. "You're different. Not just confident, you've always been that, but centered in a way I haven't seen before." "I feel different," I admitted. For years, I adapted myself to fit into Richard's world, modulating my opinions, deferring to his expertise, accepting his framing of our shared reality. There was a subtle diminishment that happened so gradually I barely noticed. Now, it's as if I've stepped back into my full self. "And what does that full self want next?" Catherine asked. "After the legal battles are concluded, after the assets are divided, after Richard is no longer the primary consideration in your decisions." The question resonated deeply. For so long, my focus had been on responding to Richard's actions, documenting his financial maneuvers, countering his legal strategies, dismantling the structures he had built to exclude me. Now, as the balance of power had shifted decisively, I had the space to consider what came after. "I want to rebuild," I said slowly. "Not just my career or my financial independence, but my sense of purpose. The forensic accounting position is a start, but there's something more I'm considering." "Tell me," Catherine encouraged. "I want to create a resource center for spouses facing similar situations, people whose partners are attempting to hide assets or leverage financial complexity to disadvantage them in divorce. Not just legal referrals, though that would be part of it, but comprehensive support, financial forensics, strategic planning, emotional counseling, even temporary funding for those without resources to fight protracted battles." Catherine's eyes lit with interest. "Using your experience as a foundation for systemic change." "Exactly," I said, feeling a spark of genuine excitement. "What happened to me isn't unique. The methods may be more sophisticated, given Richard's resources, but the fundamental dynamic, one spouse leveraging financial control to disempower the other, is depressingly common. Most people don't have the background I do, or the resources, to assemble a team like I could. You could make a significant difference, Catherine nodded, especially with your first-hand experience navigating these waters. The conversation continued, our planning becoming more detailed as the evening progressed. For the first time since receiving Richard's email, I was looking forward rather than responding to the immediate crisis. The shift in perspective was both subtle and profound, from survival to creation, from defense to purpose. The next morning brought news that solidified this forward momentum. Bradford Winters requested an urgent call with Vivian, which she took in my presence, with Catherine listening as well. My client is prepared to accept a modified version of your settlement proposal, Winters stated without preamble. Full disclosure of all assets, equitable division as determined by a mutually agreeable forensic accountant, and expedited timeline for completion. Vivian's expression remained neutral, though I caught the slight arch of her eyebrow. That's a significant shift from your previous position, Brad. May I ask what prompted this reconsideration? There was a brief pause. Mr. Harrington wishes to resolve this matter efficiently and move forward with his professional obligations. The protracted nature of these proceedings is becoming counterproductive. The translation was clear. Richard's position at Blackridge was in jeopardy. The regulatory scrutiny was expanding, and his carefully constructed professional image was crumbling. He needed to stop the bleeding, even at the cost of financial concessions he had previously refused to consider. After the call ended, Vivian turned to me. This is essentially capitulation. He's offering virtually everything we asked for in our initial settlement proposal. With one notable exception, I pointed out. There's no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no accountability for the attempted hiding of assets. That's likely non-negotiable for him, Catherine observed. Admitting to deliberate financial misconduct could have professional and potentially criminal implications. I considered this reality, weighing my priorities carefully. The accountability I wanted wasn't about public admission or punishment. It was about Richard recognizing that I was his equal, in rights, in capabilities, in determination. His surrender of the financial battle delivered that message more clearly than any forced apology could. The settlement process moved with remarkable speed after that turning point. Within 2 weeks, a comprehensive agreement had been drafted, reviewed, and executed. The terms were straightforward. Full disclosure of all assets, regardless of jurisdiction or titling, equal division of the marital estate as determined by an independent valuation, and mutual releases from future claims. Richard attended the final signing meeting in person, our second and last face-to-face encounter of the divorce process. He appeared composed, but diminished somehow. The invulnerable facade cracked to reveal the human beneath. When our eyes met across the conference table, I saw something I had rarely witnessed in our 15 years together: genuine recognition. It wasn't warmth or reconciliation, nor was it the cold calculation that had characterized so many of our interactions. It was simpler and more profound, the acknowledgement of an equal, perhaps even a superior strategist. He nodded once, a gesture that contained both concession and a certain professional respect. I returned the nod, feeling not triumph, but closure. The battle had been necessary, but was now complete. What remained was the far more interesting and rewarding work of building what came next. As we left the attorney's offices for the last time as a married couple, Richard paused. "You outplayed me," he said quietly. "I didn't think that was possible." "I know," I replied simply. No further words were necessary. He turned and walked toward the bank of elevators, a solitary figure carrying the consequences of his miscalculation. I watched him go, then turned in the opposite direction, toward the future I was already creating, one founded not on reaction to Richard's actions, but on my own vision, values, and newly reclaimed power. The divorce that had begun with his smug email announcing he had taken everything was ending with my calm certainty that I had regained far more than money or property. I had reclaimed myself, my voice, my agency, my potential. And that ultimately was the victory that mattered most. 6 months after the final settlement papers were signed, I stood at the window of my new office, watching the late afternoon sunlight play across Boston Harbor. The space was smaller than the penthouse Richard and I had shared, but infinitely more reflective of my personal aesthetic. Warm woods, comfortable seating, art selected for meaning rather than investment value. Most importantly, it was entirely mine. A physical manifestation of the independence I had reclaimed. The Blackwell Center for Financial Empowerment occupied the entire 12th floor of a renovated building in Boston's Seaport District. What had begun as a concept discussed over dinner with Catherine had rapidly evolved into a tangible reality, fueled by both my settlement resources and a surprising groundswell of support from unexpected allies. Sandra Mitchell, now promoted to managing director at Blackridge following Richard's negotiated departure, had become an early and enthusiastic board member. The financial industry has a responsibility to address the power imbalances it often enables, she had said during our initial planning meeting. Your experience highlights systemic issues that extend far beyond one marriage. The center's mission had crystallized around 3 core services: education on financial literacy and autonomy, strategic guidance for those facing financial manipulation in relationships, and direct support through a network of pro bono attorneys, accountants, and financial advisors. In our first 6 months of operation, we had already assisted over 50 clients, mostly women, but also several men who found themselves financially disadvantaged in divorce proceedings. A knock at my door interrupted my reflection. Julia Santos, who had transitioned from philanthropic advisor to the center's executive director, entered with a tablet in hand. "The quarterly numbers are impressive," she said, taking a seat in one of the comfortable chairs facing my desk. "Demand for services is outpacing our projections by almost 40%. We need to expand the advisor network." I noted joining her, especially for complex cases involving international assets or sophisticated hiding techniques. Julia nodded, making notes. "I've scheduled meetings with 3 forensic accounting firms next week. Also, the educational workshop series is consistently at capacity. We should consider adding additional sessions or perhaps developing online modules." As we reviewed operational details, I felt a deep satisfaction that transcended the professional accomplishment. The center represented not just a productive use of my skills and resources, but a transformation of my own painful experience into something constructive, a system that might prevent others from facing similar struggles without adequate support. After Julia left, I found myself reflecting on the path that had led to this moment. The year had brought changes I could never have anticipated when I first discovered Richard's financial maneuvering. Not just the divorce and settlement, but a fundamental recalibration of my identity and purpose. Richard himself had largely faded from my immediate consciousness. According to occasional mentions in financial press, he had relocated to London, accepting a less prestigious but still lucrative position with a boutique investment firm. The SEC inquiry had concluded with monetary penalties, but no criminal charges, a typically soft landing for someone of his status and connections. I felt no particular satisfaction or distress at this outcome. Richard's trajectory was no longer relevant to mine, except as historical context. The emotional ties that had once bound us, both positive and negative, had dissolved, leaving neither attachment nor animosity, just the clear-eyed recognition of a chapter concluded. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "Just landed. Dinner still on?" My sister had become a regular presence in my life, flying in monthly to serve on the center's board and to maintain our newly strengthened relationship. Tonight we were celebrating the center's 6-month milestone with dinner at the small Italian restaurant that had become our tradition. "Absolutely," I replied. 7:30 at Julia's. As I gathered my things to leave, my assistant appeared in the doorway. "You have a visitor," she said. her expression suggesting uncertainty. "He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important. A Mr. Carrington." James Carrington, Richard's oldest friend, and the man who had attempted to intimidate me during the early phases of the divorce. His appearance was unexpected, but not entirely surprising. Several figures from Richard's circle had made similar approaches in recent months, discovering that their professional paths still intersected with mine despite Richard's absence. "Send him in," I decided, curious about his purpose. James entered with less swagger than I remembered, his handshake firm but not domineering. "Eleanor, thank you for seeing me without an appointment." "Nah, what can I do for you, James?" I asked, remaining standing to signal this would be a brief conversation. He glanced around the office, taking in the evidence of success and stability. "I'm representing a client who needs precisely the type of assistance your center provides, a complex financial situation, sophisticated attempts to shield assets. When I researched resources, your organization was consistently recommended." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "You're seeking our services for a client?" He nodded, a rueful smile briefly crossing his features. "Ironic, I know, given our last interaction, but my practice involves representing clients on both sides of these situations. In this case, my client needs exactly the expertise you've assembled here." The request represented a moment of choice, to hold on to past antagonism or to move forward, guided by my center's mission rather than personal history. The decision was simpler than I might once have expected. "Have your client contact our intake coordinator," I said, handing him a business card. "We'll assess the situation and assign appropriate resources." After James left, I reflected on the encounter's significance. 6 months ago, I might have felt vindication at his acknowledgement of the center's value. Now I recognized it simply as confirmation that I was on the right path, creating something of genuine worth that transcended personal victory or validation. That evening with Catherine, over plates of handmade pasta and a bottle of Barbaresco, I shared the story of James's visit. "The ultimate validation," she observed, raising her glass in a toast. "Success truly is the best revenge." I considered her words, turning them over thoughtfully. "I'm not sure I see it as revenge anymore," I admitted. "That framework keeps me tethered to Richard, to the past. What I've built isn't about responding to him. It's about creating something new that might never have existed if our marriage had continued." Catherine studied me with the insight of someone who had known me my entire life. "That's the most profound freedom," she said softly. "When their actions no longer define your reactions. When you're moving towards something rather than away from something." Later that night, returning to my apartment overlooking the harbor, I paused to appreciate the quiet satisfaction that had become my new normal. The journey from Richard's shocking email to this moment had been neither linear nor simple. It had involved pain, struggle, strategic thinking, and ultimately transformation. The woman who had received that email declaring that her husband had taken everything was fundamentally different from the woman I had become, not because of the financial outcome, significant though that was, but because of the reclamation of self that had accompanied it. I had discovered resources within myself, strength, strategic thinking, resilience, that might have remained dormant in the comfortable but constrained life I had lived as Mrs. Richard Harrington. The divorce that Richard had intended as my diminishment had instead become the catalyst for my expansion. The assets he had attempted to hide had been not just recovered, but repurposed toward creating meaningful impact. And the future he had assumed would leave me struggling had instead opened into new possibilities I was only beginning to explore. As I watched the lights of the harbor, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness, but something rarer and more valuable: genuine peace. The kind that comes not from winning battles, but from choosing the right wars, and sometimes from refusing to fight at all in favor of creating something entirely new. The text message Richard had sent, believing it would devastate me, had indeed changed everything, just not in the way he had intended. In attempting to take everything from me, he had inadvertently set in motion the circumstances that allowed me to reclaim what mattered most: my agency, my purpose, and my authentic self. That was the story I carried forward, not one of revenge or victimhood, but of transformation and renewal. A story still being written, one decision, one day, one purposeful action at a time.